In my presentation, I'm going to be connecting James Carey's ideas about ritual communication to Simone Brown's discussion of genocide committed through racialized surveillance. Specifically, I'm going to argue that the results of surveillance are used quite differently by the perpetrators of genocide and by the survivors. Practically speaking, what genocide does is destroy or attempt to destroy the natural processes of ritual communication, the passing of culture from one generation to the next, whether through the murder of an entire people or other violences. However, these very same systems that are used to murder or destroy can afterwards be reclaimed by survivors and their children to reconstruct the systems of ritual communication that the genocide tried to erase. Brown does a very thorough and excellent job of describing how surveillance is used to commit genocide. So I'm going to focus mainly on how the victims of genocide defy these systems of surveillance, either at the time of genocide or afterwards, by survivors and their progeny. Brown discusses the defiance of surveillance practices in her book, for example, by discussing slaves that ran away despite having been branded, and art practices that question current practices of racialized surveillance. It is also worth noting that Brown uses these surveillance records in order to write her book and to reconstruct the past, bearing witness to the atrocities that were committed, and actively trying to prevent these systems from continuing to function into the present. Without these systems of surveillance that she describes, Simone Brown's research would have been impossible. This is obviously not to condone acts of surveillance or genocide, but merely to point out, like I mentioned earlier, how these documents can later be reclaimed and repurposed by survivors and reframed into a form of what Brown describes as surveillance, or to hold the perpetrators of violence and genocide accountable for what they did. I'm going to be using records kept in the Lodge Ghetto to show how my own family defied and continues to defy surveillance and record keeping that were used during the Holocaust to facilitate the Nazis' genocide. This is Rosa Norden, known to her family as Rizala or Renusha. She is my mother's first cousin. She was born in Lodz in 1936 and forced into the Lodz ghetto along with her parents and much of her extended family, including her uncle and my grandfather, in the early 1940s. She lived with her family in the ghetto until its liquidation in 1944-1945. For those of you who are not yet asking the obvious question, I'll dive into a short detour of Lodz ghetto history. In 1942, the Nazis demanded that a certain number of ghetto inmates be handed over for deportation. By that time, the Jews had deduced that those being sent away were murdered. Chaim Rumkowski, one of the people on the ghetto's council, who faced the impossible task of trying to keep the inhabitants of the ghetto alive for as long as was possible, decided that the best chance that the ghetto residents had for survival was by handing over their weakest, which meant the children under 10 and the adults over 65. Thousands of children and adults were rounded up and handed over. They were deported to Chelmno and gassed. Some families committed collective suicide to avoid being forced into handing their children over to be killed, preferring to die together than to be separated forever. Which now leads us to the obvious question of how Roisela, along with her elderly grandmother, my great grandmother, Leah Norden, avoided these deportations and continued to live with their families for another 2 or 3 years. That question is actually really easy to answer. They just lied about their ages on official documents. And we're going to take a closer look. This is a record of all the people living on Kelmline Street in the ghetto. You can see Yaakov Yosef Norden, Rosa's father, Yocheved Rivka, her mother, and Rosa herself. I found this document to be particularly fascinating and heart-wrenching because you can see how they originally put down Rosa's real date of birth, or close enough to it, which is 1937. Then they literally just crossed it out and wrote on top 1931, which aged her by 6 years. That mark on a paper saved her life for 2 or 3 years, maybe more. I can't imagine what it meant to my family at a time and in a place where pretty much everyone's children had been kidnapped and killed, for this family to remain together, and what it must have meant to them to have the girl, who was the baby of the family at the time, with them during this nightmare. Rosa was killed in Auschwitz when she was 9, so she had most of her life stolen from her, but she was able to have those few years with her family when she went to school, and she even wrote a book of poetry, which I'm not yet clear on how, ended up in the possession of my grandfather during the war. This is the tombstone of one of my ancestors, Reb Meir of Rothenburg, known as the Maharam. He lived in Germany in the 13th century. One of his most famous works was a poem of mourning he wrote about the burning of the Talmud in the 13th century France, which is still read every year on Tisha B'Av, the Jewish day of mourning. Much of his work was written while being held for ransom in a German prison, where he died after 7 years of captivity. This document shows not only how my great grandmother survived the deportation to Chelmno in 1942 by lying about her age as well. You can see she wrote 1889 instead of 1877, which was when she was actually born. And interestingly, you can see how that this document was signed by two witnesses, indicating that the Lodz ghetto inhabitants cooperated to falsify surveillance documents. But this document is also interesting because it shows how I am related to the Maharam. Before finding this document, I knew that my grandfather was a descendant of the Maharam, and I knew that I had Rothenbergs in my family tree, but neither I nor my mother knew exactly where or how we were descended, that knowledge having been lost. In this document, my great grandmother wrote her parents' names, including her mother's maiden name, which is, as you can see, Rottenberg. This document that the Nazis used to try to kill my family and destroy the knowledge being passed down from generation to generation about who we are and where we come from is the very same document that allows me to put my family history together again. I think that this shows how victims of genocide defy the whole idea of panopticism. A panoptic system assumes victims living in solitary bubbles who believe themselves to be under constant surveillance and come to comply with the values imposed upon them by the system. These documents show the impossibility of creating a truly panoptic system, as victims of genocide refuse to allow themselves to be separated, physically or emotionally, from the circles of love and care in which they live. Rather than acceding to the system or values of the watchers, in this case, the Nazis and their collaborators, the victims of genocide cooperated to falsify official documents, helping each other survive for as long as possible, and treasuring and valuing our ancestry that the Nazis believed to be degenerate and corrupted. I wanted to bring up the Maharam to make another point. I'm going to talk about Chun's theories of racism as practiced through homophily. According to Chun, the natural desire to be with people who are like you unintentionally results in the perpetuation of racist social structures, as it inevitably results in a kind of unintentional segregation. However, I would problematize this theory. Before the Holocaust, my family, or at least my mother's father's family, had been living in Germany, Poland, or that area of Europe for over 800 years before they were forced into the ghetto and later killed. I would argue that there was nothing natural about this division between Jewish Europeans and non Jewish Europeans, and the Jewish Europeans who were seen as decidedly not really Polish and not really German, etc., and thus stripped of their citizenship and ultimately their lives, and non Jewish Europeans whose identity as Europeans was perceived as more legitimate. I would argue that living in Europe for 1,000 years or more should have led to the perception of my family and Jewish European communities as legitimately European if homophily worked in truly natural rather than socially constructed ways. Even though the social divisions that exist may come to seem to us to be natural, even the seemingly most basic social categories of who is like us and who is not like us are socially constructed and maintained through forms of ritual communication. This also shows how ritual communication can be used to perpetuate violence and maintain social structures that promote violence and discrimination. For over 1,000 years, my family's non-Jewish neighbors perpetuated the idea that Jews were different and didn't belong. This is just one historical example, but I'm arguing that all of these divisions between who is part of the in group and who aren't are socially constructed categories that only come to seem natural because of how deeply we believe in them. To end off, I just showed a few examples, but these are a few of many documents that allow me to reconstruct parts of my family's history. I found wedding documents that name uncles and aunts who are partially missing from my family tree, concentration camp documents that allow me to know the exact dates and places of my family's murders and more. But I also want to emphasize how much wasn't written down, how much isn't known and never will be, and how the Holocaust and other genocides successfully destroy the stories of their victims and deny the few survivors their cultural and family inheritances. To make that point, I'm going to end with the story of Rosa Norden's book of poetry that I mentioned earlier. It was lost during the war. However, the crossed out line that saved Rosa's life and allowed her to write that book deeply shaped my own life, even before I knew about her poetry and survival of the Chelmno deportations. The memories of the short time that my grandfather had with his beloved niece were passed down from my grandfather to my mother, who eventually named one of her daughters after her cousin, Rosa. This daughter, even before she knew much about her namesake, became the family poet as soon as she learned how to write. In case you haven't pieced the puzzle together yet, that's me. Even before I knew about Rosa and her writing, I felt like I had been born partially to try to fill this void in the family created by the loss of a little girl and her book of poetry. We tend to think of ritual communication as being ritualized, as being holidays, traditions, or cultural values. But what we see here is that ritual communication can be so much bigger and so much smaller than that. These stories and acts of love, which are passed down from generation to generation, and which we come to embody. Our very identities can become a form of ritual communication, tying us to our pasts, our histories, our families, and for the children of survivors, embedding us into a process of intergenerational recovery from collective cultural traumas.